Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you are in the United States. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kadri Tastan. I'm Senior Fellow with the GMF here in Brussels, and I'm running GMF Brussels Office Turkey program. And it's really my great pleasure to welcome you all for this GMF discussion on the Turkish economy. Our webinar is titled The Turkish Economic Outlook Amid Global Turmoil. Well, the turmoil is probably the term that most clearly expresses the current situation in which we find ourselves, both economically and politically. Just as the wounds inflicted by the pandemic were beginning to heal a bit, Russia began the invasion of its independent neighbor, Ukraine, and we are witnessing a dirty war very costly from humanitarian, environmental, and other points of view. So Russia is a major energy producer, and the Russia and Ukraine are major grain producers. Therefore, quickly the effects of this war began to be felt around the world. The global effects of this war are therefore multiple. So the global inflation and rising energy prices, which began to be felt because of the pandemic, have reached much higher level with this war. Russia's use of energy as a weapon makes, of course, the situation even more difficult, and needless to say, this winter is going to be very difficult in Europe. All the indicators show that European economies are drifting into recession, and the head of JP Morgan recently warned that a US recession is also likely in 6 to 9 months. So, and according to the OECD and other international organization, a global recession is increasingly likely. As for Turkey, the country's economic situation has been deteriorating since 2018, so long before the pandemic and the war in Ukraine began. And since then, Turkey has experienced several currency crises, and only last year, Turkish lira lost around 45% of its value, and it has lost nearly a quarter of its value this year. So the country is facing a galloping inflation reminiscent of the 90s. Turkish inflation climbed to a 24-year high of 84% in September. So the inflation rate in Turkey is not even, of course, comparable to the global inflation rates that affects many countries today. And we know that due to inflationary pressures on worldwide scale, many central banks from both emerging and advanced economies have responded by pivoting toward tighter monetary policy and higher interest rates. But the Central Bank of Turkey, on the contrary, opted for a loose monetary policy and lowered interest rates, which pushed inflation, as I said, over 80%. So how can this unorthodox monetary policy of Turkish Central Bank be explained? What is really Ankara's objective with this economic policy, and what are the short, medium, and long-term implications for Turkish economy and also politics, maybe? So there are many questions that we will try to respond with my guests, and for this we have a really great panel today. Please let me to introduce them first. My first panelist is Gulcin Ozkan. Gulcin is professor of finance at the King's College Business School. Gulcin Hocam, welcome. Thank you very much for joining. Our second speaker is Professor Guven Sak. Guven Sak was the founding manager director of the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey, TOBB, and he's currently the president and CEO of the TOBB Global. Guven Hocam, welcome. And our third speaker is my colleague from GMF here in Brussels office, Jakob Kirkegaard. Jakob, thank you very much for joining the discussion. So before starting, let me first to mention that this online event is a part of series of events organized as part of GMF-TOBB Fellowship on Turkey, Europe, and Global Issues, launched by GMF in partnership with the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchange of Turkey in 2017. And so we are really grateful to TOBB for this support. Just to say that this is on the record, and it will be also on YouTube after the event. So if you would like to put a question also, please use Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. Thank you very much for this. So Gulcin Hocam, I would like to start with you. So could you please help us to understand a bit the Turkish monetary policy and the effect of this policy and the motivation behind it, as well as the long-term effects and maybe results as well? Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Really, I really appreciate the invitation. There are so many big questions that we as economists worrying about at present. So all the questions that you raise are really crucial ones. What I would like to do as the first person on this panel, just to set the scene regarding the global economy, both in terms of the challenges that we face at present. This includes obviously inflation and particular challenges facing emerging economies, given that we are going to talk about Turkey, and then finish off, I'm sure we will return to this issue of monetary policy, rather heterodox monetary policy in Turkey. So let me see if I can just share my screen. So is this all working fine?
So far, yes.
Excellent.
You should just maybe extend this screen.
So just for some reason, this is not allowing me to go full screen.
Yes. Well, I mean, even like that is visible. It would been great to have the full screen, but if you cannot be, I mean, it's also visible like that, I think.
Okay, let me just go ahead with this. If I can do that throughout the conversation,
yeah.
I can. So I would really like to start by showing you two slides in terms of the global growth in two sets of countries. One is emerging economies, one is advanced economies in two time periods. I think this is really very much, to me, the core of why emerging economies are finding themselves at a point where they are facing much greater challenges than they did in the immediate aftermath of global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. So here we have growth in the aftermath of COVID. We have the red line indicating advanced economies, and we have the orange line and the kind of the yellowish line, emerging markets with and without China. So we can clearly see that advanced economies are moving out of that, obviously, the predicament in 2020 much faster, although it's stabilizing, much faster than emerging economies with and without China. Now, this is in sharp contrast to what happened in the aftermath of global financial crisis, which in itself was very interesting. So here we have the emerging economies indicated by yellow and advanced economies with red. And very clearly, emerging economies found it a lot easier than advanced economies in terms of their recovery in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. And there are many reasons. There's a huge literature on why this has been the case, but two main reasons. One is they were not the source of the crisis during the global financial shock, and also the near zero interest rates, which I'm going to come to, helped emerging economies to recover significantly. Now, why this comparison is important, the reason why it's important is that now we face a very different set of circumstances. The advanced economies' response by taking the interest rates to near zero levels on that occasion greatly helped emerging economies. Now, given where inflation is, advanced economies are having to do exactly the opposite, pushing emerging economies into a different direction. Now, this week, IMF just came out with its World Global Outlook, and their forecast is for the global economy to contract, I mean, not contract in terms of recession, but to grow much less than expected even as of last year. So here we have the world economy. The red dots are 2021 average, and the blue bars indicating forecast, and forecast obviously changing, and in fact changing in the sense that we are expected, the world economy is expected now to grow by 2.7% in 2023, which is going to be the slowest, weakest growth since 2001, except the worst periods of global financial crisis and the early periods of the COVID period. So why is this relevant to our discussion here? It's relevant because it's making the emerging economies face very different sort of challenges that they faced in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So here we have the emerging market and developing economies spreads, and that's comparison of August 2021 and August 2022. We can see that in all groups, there is a significant increase in the spreads. So emerging economies are finding it increasingly costly to borrow, and that's to be expected in terms of where interest rates, global interest rates are moving. So the next three slides are really setting the scene for Turkey and the macroeconomic policy mix in Turkey. So this is again from the IMF Global Outlook, just came out this week. So here they are categorizing countries into G20 countries into fiscal monetary policy mix. Clearly, given the inflation expectations on the rise and very sharply rising inflation, countries are moving in a contractionary direction, in a tightening direction in both monetary and fiscal policy. So that's the upper quarter. And Turkey is on the bottom left quarter, and that's kind of in a league of its own. It's the only country that's following loose monetary policy and loose fiscal policy. So this is loose fiscal policy. We can talk about this later on, particularly in relation to the upcoming elections and the dynamics that will bring in. But even in the absence of that, Turkey is following a loose monetary policy in an international environment where inflation is at 40-year high, as Kadri mentioned at the beginning. Obviously, when we talk about high, we are talking about very different levels. For advanced economies or global economy in general, we are talking about averages of 8-9%. Turkey's inflation is 10 times that. You know, at that background, we have a loose monetary policy. Now, why is this additionally concerning? So I have this plot. This is the exchange rate vis-a-vis US dollar, the widely referred to surging of the dollar. Dollar is at its strongest since early 2000s. And here we see a large number of countries, at least within this sample, currencies losing value against the US dollar, and some advanced economies included in that. The UK, where I'm joining you today, is obviously among those. But we can also note that Turkey is the one where the currency has lost maximum value against the US dollar. So that's something we might want to come back to when we discuss monetary policy. Finally, I think very interestingly, here we have emerging markets interest rate moves. So this is interest rate moves very recently in response to changing global circumstances. We can clearly see that great majority of countries are taking a decision to hike their rates, and Turkey is in absolute minority. In fact, more recently, it's the only country that is reducing its policy rate in response to rising inflation. So I would stop by saying a few words about Turkish monetary policy. I think over the last 5-10 years, we have all spoken, written, research about Turkish monetary policy more than we would have liked. If I would need to pick one word to categorize it, I would say that Turkey's monetary policy framework is one that is paralyzed at the moment. What do I mean by that? How do you normally execute monetary policy? You observe expected inflation and you vary your policy instrument, which is the policy rate, in response to those developments. In Turkey, that has stopped to be the case for some time now. This is aggravated by the presidential regime, but it's not just new. It has been for a while. So Turkey has now taken down its policy rate to 12% from 19% in March 2021, had 4 governors in 5 years, and now at a position where, as we have clearly seen, in a league of its own. And this is obviously storing trouble going forward. And the question, if the question is there an explanation for that? The simple answer is absolutely not. And we may want to come back to this discussion later on. I don't want to take any more than my own 10 minutes.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Gulcin Hocam. Thanks for this. So with this, Jakob, maybe we can continue with you. Well, Gulcin gave us also this global picture. So given the global economic situation and also the geopolitical risks, energy crisis, inflation, what should be expecting for developing countries like Turkey? How do you see the situation, the risk for these countries? And we'd like to have also your point of view on that. Over to you.
No, sure. Well, I think, first of all, I agree with pretty much everything that Gulcin said. The data is is not controversial, if I could put it that way. So what we should expect? Well, clearly, again, if you take the most recent IMF projections as a forecast, we are heading into something that, what is the rule of thumb is, if you go below 3% of global growth, then it feels like a recession, right? And that's what the IMF projects. And then the question is, to what extent is this just a cyclical blip due to all these sort of idiosyncratic shocks we're suffering right now from the war in Russia, obviously a spike in interest rates, energy prices, etc. And to what extent is it the new normal? Well, I guess I would say that in terms of what emerging markets can expect, there are not much good news, frankly. In the short run, I would certainly expect US interest rates to go even higher than what many market forecasts currently project. They're saying, look, we should expect a potential terminal rate of about 4.5, 4.75. I think that's too low to break the current set of labor market circumstances in the United States. I think the Federal Reserve will go higher than that. I think, therefore, we should expect the Federal Reserve towards the end of 2023 to have US short-term interest rates of about 5.5%, maybe even 6%. And this is almost certain. Indeed, it is the intent to cause a short and shallow recession in the United States. Because this is really what is needed, in my opinion, to break the core inflation levels of about 5%. You basically need, because you now post-COVID have a labor market, in my opinion, in the United States that operates considerably worse than it did pre-COVID, you need to bring down the demand for labor, unfortunately, quite a bit. And the monetary policy instrument to do that is unfortunately raising them higher. So in the short run, therefore, all the financial pain for emerging markets associated with higher rates, higher US rates, more costly dollar refinancing, etc., I think is going to be worse in the next 12 months than what current forecasts project. I also, on the other hand, think that because rates are going to be they're going to be increased that much, they're also not going to stay up there, because the intent, as I said, is to cause de facto, in my opinion, a shallow recession in the United States, and then rates are going to come back down again. So it's going to be more of a boom-bust cycle, unfortunately, from the perspective of short-term US policy rates. I think, on the other hand, there are other issues that, so this is kind of, the short-term bad news for emerging markets. I think, on the other hand, there are also longer-term negative news, unfortunately. The first one is the Chinese economy. I am personally very encouraged, in a way, by the fact that the IMF is finally bringing itself to forecast Chinese growth rates of only about 3%. On the other hand, I regard the idea that a country that has suffered the kind of economic lockdowns that China has during 2022 as having any kind of growth as frankly nonsensical. So I think the real number in China for 2022 is 0. And it might even be in a recession. And I think the reality is that the IMF obviously is under a lot of political pressure not to diverge too far from, the Chinese government's forecasted goal of somewhere around 5%. They have managed to get down to 3, but the reality is, in my opinion, given what we know and can see is going on in the Chinese economy, it's simply not credible to believe that you can lock down the country on an ongoing basis the way the Chinese government has done, including the main financial centers in Shanghai, etc., and think that this generates growth. I think it's nonsense, to be perfectly frank. But what it means is that these lockdowns and the way the Chinese economy has been stimulated during the pandemic, which unfortunately is kind of the same way it was stimulated during the Chinese response to the global financial crisis, namely not the way we did it, quote unquote, in the West, by issuing massive consumption, basically printing money and giving it to consumers to spend. That's not the way it's done in China. It's more real estate investments, it's more tax cuts to businesses, etc. It's basically supply side reforms, which means that, while at the same time, of course, the lockdowns and the ongoing housing market correction or collapse, pick your noun, means that domestic demand in China is being crushed. So, but on the other hand, you have companies that have very good production, if they're not locked down, that is, very good possibilities to export. So what you have seen is Chinese exports go through the roof in the last 12 to 15 months, which of course translates into a lot of additional competition for other emerging markets. And the inability the Chinese trade surplus is rising rapidly, which I would argue is not good news for other emerging markets. But actually the worst economic news for emerging markets, in my opinion, that is coming out of China is that in my opinion, accelerating demographic, again, call it decline, call it collapse, call it whatever you want, but transition in China is going to mean that the long-term potential growth rate in China, in my opinion, is no more than 2%. And this is the number you will arrive at if you take a very basic sort of SOLAR growth model calculation and say, okay, what is the growth rate of China's potential labor force or working age population going forward? Well, we know that it's negative up to about 1% a year. What is the growth rate of capital deepening in China? Well, obviously we don't know that, but we know that China has been having gross fixed capital formation running at about 42 to 44% of GDP in the last 12, 15 years. We also know that the probability that they can go even higher than that, in my opinion, is very unlikely. So the capital formation component of long-term potential growth rate is probably also negative in China. That leaves you with productivity. The problem, unfortunately, is that productivity in total factor productivity in the Chinese economy in the last 10 years has actually been quite low. The latest IMF Article 4 report on China estimated it at less than 1%. So if you add up those three components, you do not get a number anywhere near 4 to 5%, which is the number that the Chinese government runs around talking about, and therefore also organizations like the IMF and others are kind of have to use. Many private sector banks use them because if they don't, they're going to lose business in China. But I think the reality is that the Chinese long-term potential growth rate on the best of days is 2%. That, of course, means that the Chinese economy is not going to be the kind of growth locomotive for the global economy and other emerging markets that it has been for the last 20 odd years. So the current cyclical dip, if you like, to about somewhere between around 3% for global growth may not, unfortunately, be just a dip, but could very well be much closer to the new norm than we would like to believe, something that, of course, has very significantly adverse effects on also emerging markets. And then finally, there's one additional aspect that I think will be a negative, which is that you really are witnessing an accelerated technology rivalry between China and the United States. Last week, we saw the Biden administration very, very significantly tighten export control legislation and regulation for pretty much any aspect of US export of semiconductor technology and AI technology, et cetera, to China. This is just one indication of the fact that the economic rivalry between China and the United States is, if anything, accelerating, which will mean, in my opinion, that more and more businesses, as well as governments, also in emerging markets, are going to be compelled to choose. Whose side are you on? Which market do you want to supply? And de facto, we're going to see more and more bifurcated supply chains, one that is sort of US Western-centric and one that is China-centric. Instead of replacing a single global supply chain. This is generally inflationary. It raises costs of production, and it will put a lot of also emerging market economies in a very significant policy and therefore also business dilemma going forward. So unfortunately, I don't have much good news to share with you, other than perhaps it is my conviction that the war in Ukraine will be over a lot sooner than we think, because I believe that Ukraine will win the war militarily in a comprehensive and convincing manner. So I don't think the war will be with us for more than 6 months from now, at which point Russia will be defeated and compelled to leave Ukrainian territory. So let me end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jakub. Well, Professor Sak, now I can turn to you. So you heard Gulcin and Jakub. So tell us what is in this situation? What is the major risk for Turkish economy in coming months or maybe years?
Okay, let me start by what I understand from the discussions. I was reading the UNDP's new Human Development Report these days. It's titled "Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives." So, I see so much pessimism. It is now a big philosophical portion. I think that needs to be read carefully, but I find many of the discussions a little bit pessimistic when it comes to the age that we are in. I mean, these are interesting times. New things things that hasn't happened for a very long time ago. It hasn't happened for a very long time. Is now happening. The pandemic and this climate change risks are becoming more and more visible. These are important issues, of course, but I feel myself a little bit optimistic regarding Turkey in this new setting. Let me say it that way. The risk in this period, for globally, I think, is that maybe I can term it that way. Whenever we had crises in the previous times, we usually bounce back to the previous situation. We bounce back. It's about bouncing back. It was like that in 2008 crisis too. But this is a new situation. This is kind of, we need to redefine our lives now. I think there is an understanding regarding that. That's how I look at this whole discussions about the Green Deal or Green New Deal. So this time it's about bouncing future, bouncing to future, bouncing to an uncertain future. I think that makes things very difficult, and that makes the transition period, the transitory stage also, very difficult to manage. So we have to understand the seriousness. The pessimism, I think, is related with the fact that this is something that hasn't happened before. This is a major turning point, I think, in history. That's how I'm looking at the Russia-Ukraine war too. I mean, if I look at the countries around Turkey, I see many losers around. All the hydrocarbon producers, natural resource producing nations, I think are going to lose. And Russians during Medvedev times did their best to transform their economy, to take part in the technology competition, but they couldn't do it. So they know that from 10 years from now, 15 years from now, they know that they are going to be in a worse situation than they are today. So I think that makes things risky. That makes things more risky when you come to this bouncing to the future, to an uncertain future thing. If you have that in mind, that makes it more difficult in countries like Turkey, where institutions are not strong. Because when you have stronger institutions, then you can cope with the changes more easily. You can plan for the future more easily. But that makes things very hard for countries like Turkey and for emerging markets in general too, I think, at the same time. I think that's the reason, that's the major reason for the rising pessimism, especially for countries like Turkey, for the emerging markets countries in this environment. When we come to Turkey, Turkey, first of all, let me say the good part of the story, transformed itself into an industrial country in the last 2 decades or 3 decades. It started in the 1980s with the opening up process in the Turkish economy. Then the EU accession process came, and Turkey has turned itself into an industrial country by the help of the customs union arrangement with the European Union. I think EU has transformed Turkey, which is, I think, which is a success story. But what we have, I think, Kadri, you have mentioned unorthodox or heterodox economic policy thing. This is neither unorthodox nor heterodox. It's not an economic policy also. What we have in Turkey at the moment. And the good side of the story is that despite falling down from a hill, bleeding, etc., there is no fundamental damage yet. I mean, the bones are okay, the fundamentals are okay, and there is no internal bleeding as far as I see up until now. So bouncing back from here, if you have a plan, if you understand the global developments, regional developments, if you see the opportunities there, I think it's not that big a problem for Turkey, because the structural reform agenda is already there with the decarbonization agenda that already took shape and that's taking shape in the European Union. I think this framework for customs union modernization, which should be based on the decarbonization agenda, is very useful for Turkey. And the second part is that, Turkey is going to have elections very soon. We have around 8 months. So many things may change in 8 months. But I think this election is going to be it's the economy stupid moment for the Turks. Because we never have seen, as far as I know in my lifetime, we never have seen this rapidly rising inflation in this country. I mean, we had high inflation periods, but rapidly rising inflation in a very short period of time is something new that we need to cope with, I think. And if you look at the near future, there are many problems. I completely agree. And I think that brings us to the other important risk that Turkish economy may face, because what's happening in Europe now, the slowing down process in Europe is going to influence Turkish economy negatively. I mean, exports are going to decline. Because around 60% of our exports are going to the G7 countries. Around 48% is going to the EU markets. And Turkey transformed itself into an industrial country, but one thing hasn't changed. Turkey always had a current account deficit, and we need to finance this thing. I think our current account deficit and our financing of the current account deficit is the major link that is tying us to the West, to the Western US dollar markets. It's an important issue that needs to be done, and that brings us now regarding the rising current account deficit. If you look at the estimations of the current account deficit levels that the experts are talking about, this is too high to finance, and this winter is problematic for Turkey in terms of the balance of payments performance of the country. And all these things, this issue of financing the rising current account deficit and the reliance of Turkey on Russia in terms of its, natural resource imports, I think makes things difficult for Turkey. Turkey, because of this heavy reliance on Russia, around 48% of our current deficit is against Russia. So it's an important supplier. Russia is an important supplier for us, and it's basically, also involves iron and steel and food too, grain too, but it's basically natural resources that we are buying from Russia. That reliance made Turkey a little bit reluctant when it comes to complying with the sanctions against Russia. So we are not part of the sanctions against Russia. But it is one thing not being part of the sanctions against Russia, but it's another thing to help Russia to evade the sanctions. So I think Turkey is now coming to a kind of a movement of truth regarding its balancing policy in this debate. And I don't think that this Russia-Ukraine war thing is going to end very soon, especially not through this winter. We are still going to have similar problems during this period of time. So that makes, if one risk for Turkey and countries like Turkey is the lack of strong institutional framework, that includes also the economic policy making capacity, especially the deterioration in that area in the last couple of years. I think the second issue now is related with the end of this balancing policy capacity of the country at this moment. This is a kind of a moment of truth. And I think the major risk there is to for our allies in the West to have a kind of a disproportionate actions against this, at this moment of truth. I see that also as an important risk now at this stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Sak. Let me to remind our audience that first of all, and then I would like to continue with you, maybe Professor Sak, about the sanction issues, because it's obvious that it's becoming an important issue. So maybe we can a bit go further on this discussion. Please, yes, our audience, please put your question and use this Q&A function. As you said, Guven Hocam, Western officials have grown increasingly anxious that Turkey could be serving as a backdrop for evasion of sanction aimed at punishing Vladimir Putin for his invasion of Ukraine as a part of the EU custom union, of course, that also has a strong economic and political link to Turkey, actually, with Moscow. So it offers a possible loophole for the Western or Turkish business that want to sell goods in Turkey. And we saw that just recently the EU's Financial Services Commissioner visited Ankara last week to deliver probably her own messages to the Turkish officials and also businesses. And it's true that there are reports that the export from Turkey to Russia had soared since the start of the war. So maybe you can a bit open up. And what's your, I mean, is this, because it's also some are also expressing this as an opportunity, but I have impression that you see as a major risk mostly. What we can expect on this, I mean, in the recent, the European Commission published its report on Turkey, and even in that report also it's mentioning this risk and the functioning of the custom union. So we are not there even to discuss the updating of the custom union, but with this it's becoming even much more complicated. Do you think that it can really affect the functioning of the custom union? What we can expect if the Europeans are showing their red lines, or where is the red lines for you? Go ahead, please.
Regarding customs union, the customs union as we know it, I think has already ended with this Green Deal discussions, with that decarbonization agenda and digital transformation, digital single market studies when the backbone of trade is changing this rapidly, becoming digitalized, I think there is the need to revisit the customs union, modernize the customs union anyway. That's something that's already given, I think. But this is a new situation because we have close ties with Russia. I think this thing has all started this summer with Russian tourists still coming to Turkey. So it's not that big, that huge an amount. It's about 1.5 billion or about $2 billion of tourism revenues for Turkey. But when tourists come, they need to make payments. They need to pay the hotel bills. They need to go to restaurants, pay their bills, etc. And that led to a situation with all the sanctions. That led to a situation where a kind of a ruble lira tourism area, let me say, has emerged as a result of that. By itself, it emerged. If you don't cut the tourism, and that's an important source of revenue for Turkey, as I have already mentioned, the importance of current account deficit for the country. So there are understandable reasons for the relations. But then our partners in the West have started to see the loopholes that may create room for evading the sanctions, because when you enter into financial transactions, then there are possibilities. So the possibilities may easily emerge, and of course the Russians The sanctions are biting Russia. There is no question about it. I mean, it's biting on the defense front, on the arms industry front, but also it's also biting Russia in terms of the consumer goods that they have to find for their population. And when all the Western companies left Russia, and they left Russia, then they have been looking, the Russians have been looking for alternative mechanisms to supply those goods, those consumer goods, from textile products to refrigerators, to supply those products from Turkey. And as I have mentioned, by the help of the EU, Turkey has turned itself an industrial country, and Turkey could do things on that front. But then that opens up, discussions about how the payments are going to be made, whether the Russian Mir card is going to be used, Mir payment system is going, because there is the need for a payment mechanism at the end of the day. And because of the sanctions, the existing ones are not functioning properly. Then this election, this winter has come. In 2018, when we had current account, when we had balance of payment difficulties, Russians postponed some of the natural gas payments for Turkey. So that opens up new discussions about whether they can do that again. But if the Russians did that in 2018, was a totally different period of time. If the Russians did that at that time just to create discord in the Western alliance, now they have concrete needs now that needs to be met. Some goods need to be flown to Russia. Their supermarkets need new products. So there is a new situation now. And that new situation, I think, leads to all this discussion about whether it is proper, whether it is evading sanctions or not. I think it's a legal discussion, but I think the current situation that we are in, the coming elections, the problems of this coming winter, the possible economic problems of this coming winter is creating this interesting discussion about whether Turkey is going to help Russia in evading the sanctions. I still don't see any concrete finger pointing regarding that, but there are possibilities, of course.
Thank you very much, Jakob. I would like to continue with you. You mentioned China's American competition, and how do you see the European countries on this competition? Because the European countries have to define also precise objective and prepare for, let's say, for the new geoeconomic and geopolitical war that will inevitably result from this war. So how do you see, and how do you see Turkey also in this picture? This is my
I mean, certainly starting with the EU, I mean, yes. I think the basic point here is that, quite frankly, in my opinion, the Chinese have made it fairly easy for the Europeans. Chinese diplomacy in Europe has been a disaster. I mean, all this wolf warrior stuff and the clear attempts to intimidate, say, Lithuania on customs and trade access, the fallouts with other individual smaller countries in the EU, the Czech Republic, Sweden, and others over, basically the Chinese repeatedly assuming, it seems, that they can bully, if you like, individual members of the EU into reversing policies. That's not how the EU works. And even if the German or French government may be interested in selling more Airbuses, etc., to China, that's still not how the EU works. So I think it's not only because obviously the United States has been pushing very hard for the EU on, exclusion of Huawei and other Chinese equipment from European infrastructure. It is, as much as I said, China's own diplomacy, and obviously the crackdowns in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, have created a much more skeptical, if not outright hostile, environment politically in Europe to China. And obviously the fact that the Chinese government has gone ahead and actually sanctioned individual members of the European Parliament means that there is there is zero chance of a further, if you like, trade or investment agreement or anything material, in my opinion, between China and the EU going forward, or at least until that changes. So, I would say it is probably more China's fault than US pressure that has pushed the EU into a much more into a position much more aligned with the United States broadly in the sort of US-China rivalry globally. Turkey. Well, I would certainly Turkey in many ways, as I see it, have been a much more independent actor, both vis-a-vis obviously Russia, but also with China. There is, of course, a particular issue in Xinjiang, where clearly President Erdogan has, as I see it, from time to time, felt the need to raise the issue, which of course is not liked in Beijing. But ultimately, as I see it, it's going to be very difficult for Turkey to find a middle road, if you like, between China and the United States. So at some point, Turkey is going to have to declare its colors, so to speak. We're not there yet, clearly, but I think that time is coming.
Thank you very much, Jacob. Gulcin Hocam, let's continue with you. Turkey, it has been mentioned, will have presidential and parliamentary election in June. So, what do you think is the most serious risk for the Turkish economy between now and the election? In an electoral context, obviously no one expects to see a tight monetary policy in Turkey, right? And given the current account deficit, the state of the central bank reserves, how will the government hold up? Surely, the tourism helped during this summer, but the tourism season is over now. And so-called net errors and omissions were at really record high during this summer. So how do you see the situation? And you can also go a bit more in details on the monetary policy with this.
Thank you. It's such an interesting set of issues. Yeah. I think we can't stop watching what is obviously unfolding both in Turkey and globally. So there are global risk factors, there are regional or group-specific risk factors, but there are also clearly risk factors arising from these very high-stake elections forthcoming in Turkey. So on the basis of what we have discussed so far, it looks like, from a global point of view, it's almost like, as somebody who has been doing work with economic theory for a very long time, I see this as a case of multiple equilibria, right? There's potentially a good equilibrium where countries, a set of countries could follow right set of climate policies. They would be on the right side of geopolitical fragmentation. They have the right set of institutions, and they converge on this good equilibrium. Going forward, there are obviously opportunities as well as costs and risks. On the other hand, there is a greater risk, probably ex ante, that you might end up in a bad equilibrium where we have all these political risks, geopolitical risks, and the combination of challenges we haven't seen before. I think it would be uncontentious to say unprecedented in the sense that we haven't had a pandemic before, at least until the last 100 years. We need to go back to 1918 to have a similar experience in terms of a pandemic, in terms of the consequences of that. And then the global economy was in a very, very different shape than now, particularly much more integration now, making it harder for countries to devise policies independently. So this is kind of the global conjuncture we find ourselves, but there are additional risks arising from Turkey's special circumstances. Energy, obviously, we talked about. Europe is a lot more reliant on energy than UK, for example. What would that mean if the war goes on longer than expected or longer than this winter? That has very clear implications for Europe. I've seen, I think in the Q&A, there was a question about Germany. Germany is in fact is forecast to contract. It's only one of the only two countries in European Union, with Italy is the other one, and UK grows, but forecast to grow very, very slowly. So that clearly, given Turkey's interactions in terms of international trade with Europe, that will have second round, but not insignificant second round effects on Turkey. This is even before we begin to think about its special circumstances. So special circumstances, one is reliance on external finance. This is mentioned by Professor Sak clearly. When I talked about this good equilibrium, bad equilibrium, the probability of a set of countries going to one rather than other will be significantly impacted by how reliant they are on external finance. Turkey is obviously in that category, very much relying on external finance to finance its ongoing current account deficits. So that turmoil, possible turmoil in international financial markets arising from the need to increase interest rates in central countries, as Jakub started his talk talking about, that has an immediate risk for a country like Turkey. If you rely on international financial markets, and there is the chance of that turbulence in international financial markets, these are all adding to your risk factors. So that's even before we talk about the impending election. So, there's a huge literature on the dynamics of elections, what it would mean for individual countries. You expect incumbents to go for loose policies in election years. This is not a surprise. And we know the consequences. What happens is you have very expansionary policy in the election year to appear competent to the electorate, to increase your chances of re-election. That obviously would be would reveal itself as high economic activity in election year, but once beyond, obviously it's going to lead to high inflation and all the consequences that you would expect. You remember, we are already starting with very high inflation rates, with monetary policy and in general macro policy framework very weak, deteriorated significantly over the last decade, and you find yourself in a position with a unique set of challenges. So what I expect going forward is a set of difficulties arising from international risk factors, as we mentioned, but also domestic risk factors, because Turkey is pushing itself to this quarter, as I've shown you in the data, this quarter where it's in a league of its own, the only country following loose fiscal and monetary policy. It cannot reverse its stance on monetary policy. That's not going to pay off in an election year, having held this position for such a long time that I give zero probability event. On the other hand, obviously loose fiscal policy you expect in an election year. And the combination of that, given where the inflation is obviously a huge predicament in a post-election year, whoever wins, whether the elections are held in June or before.
Thank you very much. Actually, we have just, thank you, Gulcin Hocam. We have lost Jakub because he has just sent me an email. The power is cut in his house. So hopefully he will be able to join us again.
Implications of energy crisis, I would say.
Exactly, yes. I would like to again invite our audience to put their questions, but we have already some questions. I would like to bring one. An anonymous attendee is asking this question. He or she is asking, what would be the possible negative effect if the current government win the elections again? What is the alternative? It would be very interesting to us if you can give us some notice about that. So this is the question. Would you like to, Gulcin Hocam or Guven?
I could very briefly attempt.
Yes.
I think it's very, very risky to prejudge election outcomes. It's always risky. But in my view, if, you know, as objectively as possible, if I can assess the potential cost, I think potential cost of re-election to me would be a permanent deterioration in policymaking frameworks. I mean, the hope, when we look at where the institutions are and where they have come from, I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that they were in a fantastic place to start with, but I think, you know, we would mostly agree that there has been a significant deterioration. My worry would be that that would be a permanent state of affairs if that continued. And that, to me, to be honest, is not sustainable. Yeah, you can go on pushing the economy, living beyond your means and out of the orthodoxy, but that can only be a temporary state of affairs. You will need to have to go back to orthodoxy. Orthodoxy, I mean, this is a very interesting conversation, actually, coming from UK. We have this big discussion about what economic orthodoxy means. It's really the collection of experience. It's what we have learned out of our experiences. And it's a collection of wisdom. I don't think it's very much subject to interpretation, and that collection of wisdom, you can live beyond that, but that's only temporary. So you can push the economy beyond its means, but sooner or later you are going to have to pay the price for that. So in my view, continuation with the current set of policies would make that kind of looming date sooner. That's not sustainable in my view, and that was never sustainable.
Thank you very much. Guven Hocam, would you like to comment on this, or
let me rephrase it. I see more questions about the election outcome, etc. So I think the issue is whether a turnaround in the Turkish economic policy framework is possible. I think it is. I mean, after the elections, whoever wins, this framework that we have, the situation that we have, is not sustainable. It has got to change. It's going to be easier if there are new faces around. It's going to be harder if we have the old faces around. Anyway, it's going to change. And it's going to change on both fronts, because I think one important issue is to deal with this reputation problem that we now have, to deal with this policy credibility issue. I think it has to start with the presidential system. A revision of the presidential system is adamant, if you ask me. It's not the fact about our presidential system is that it's not only one person making all decisions, it's an arrangement for that. It's not only that, but it is also led to a situation where Turkey abolished the undersecretariats in all our ministries. And our undersecretariats in Turkish, since the Ottoman times, in our public administration, I think is the basis, were the basis for policy making capacity. I think we abolished. That's how I understand Gulcin Hanım's, remark about the erosion of institutional capacity. That's how I understand that. When you abolish that, then and you don't put any alternative for that, then you lose. That's what we have. We lost our policy making capacity, and it's not only on economic policy front. It's also in foreign policy front. It's I mean, you name it. It's in everywhere now. So I think that needs to be mended. We have to amend this situation first of all. And this is, I think, this is not tied to the result of the elections. For sustainability purposes, they have got to do it anyway. I don't know how they can do it, but that needs to be done. And secondly, I don't want to say orthodoxy, but let's say sound economic policies has to come back. And sound here is, you know, there was that saying that, you know, experience is a collection of your mistakes. If you learn from your mistakes, then you have experience. So I think that's what we need to do. We make these mistakes. I mean, this is not the first time that we are making mistakes. I can find you other examples in Turkish economic policy making history. That's also, you know, related with. I mean, just similar mistakes were made in the past too. When it comes to Turkey, so I think when there is a sound economic policy framework, when there is policy credibility, a strong structural reform agenda, and there is already an agenda, as I have mentioned. And I think this time, as poverty incidence has been on the rapid rise now since 2018, some kind of, you know, strengthening the social protection mechanisms in Turkey is of utmost importance now. I think we saw that first as a result of the pandemic, how weak our social protection or structure has been. We had seen that. But now I think we need to revisit that area and do something regarding that. So it's, you know, no matter what's going to happen as a result of the elections, I think there is going to be a turnaround. I mean, it's obvious if you ask me. The situation that we are in is unsustainable, and it is more and more unsustainable in this geopolitical situation, geopolitical environment too.
Thank you very much. It's a question from Paul Levin about he's asking about the difficulty of financing the current account deficit or a potential coming balance of payment risk. So he's asking, the government will want to stimulate the economy in advance of the election. Of course, we have already spoke about it. Will there be money for short-term sprint?
Could I come in?
Go ahead, please.
There has to be, given the high stake elections, I think probably the highest stake elections in the last 20 years, we will see a huge heating on the fiscal side. There's already a number of initiatives already talked about, so there will be that sprint. I'm sure about that. So how does this turn into difficulty in terms of international financing? Now, already there is a significant drop in the non-residents' share in Turkish financial markets. So in some ways, this is not new. This has been happening slowly or fast over the last few years, depending upon what happens with policy. Now, monetary policy, we talked about monetary policy that is outside the realm of conventional wisdom, that clearly signals to international financial markets that this particular market is risky than you anticipated. Now, I'm having to check again and again what is the remit of Turkish central banks, because every time there's a meeting, the announcement is about exports and investment and growth. I go back because I teach this to my second-year students, and I always go back and check, has this changed since I checked this last time? But it hasn't. It is really the primary responsibility of Turkey's central bank, monetary authority, is price stability. So every policy rate decision you take, that has to be the core of your consideration. And that isn't. And more interestingly and surprisingly, in Turkey, the fact that the real activity is desensitized towards interest rate changes is presented as success. This is incredible. You know, what you are doing is you have a fight, you have enemies coming your way, you have this tool is interest rates, and you are making it more blunt and you are happy about it. This is incredible. You know, that's your main tool. So on the observation of such nonsensical actions, clearly you lose credibility in international financial markets. That makes it harder and harder to finance that current account deficits. Obviously, the fact that we haven't had a huge balance of payments crisis means that you somehow find a way of continuing that finance, but that's always at a higher and higher cost. So you have to pay that risk premium. And we see that in CDS, we see that in spreads, and that's obviously ongoing at a higher cost. And if this goes on, obviously, and this will go on, we will obviously observe an increase, possibly a significant increase in cost of attracting funding from outside. The financial conditions already changed. So that's your basis. You are going to have to pay a greater risk premium on top of that. And that's, to me, the difficulty in financing your current account deficits. And that's going to go on as you go on with that irrational policy structure.
Thank you very much. Guven Hoca, would you like to comment on this? There's also a question asked to you directly in the Q&A. Actually, you have already answered this partially, because the question is, what is from Alexander Karapiperis? What's going on to be the effect of political instability from the next year's election? He says either unwanted Erdogan from the global capital markets, or a very inexperienced, a really unstable six-party coalition future government. Do you have any comments on that? Go ahead, please.
Okay, I have comments, but I don't know. You know, it's about guessing for the future. But I can tell you this part. I think the problem with the newcomers is that for the first time, a group of people are going to come to govern a country, but they have to create their posts, their responsibilities. They have to define their responsibility sets. So in normal elections, you know, when you get your votes, etc., you know the share of votes of every political party. The biggest one, let's say, become the prime minister. Second one can get these. So in the constitutional system, all the seats and their responsibilities ought to be defined beforehand. But when these newcomers are going to come, they have to redefine this whole framework. If they don't want the presidential system, and it's obvious that the presidential system that we have now is not functioning, is not delivering results. And it is obvious that the administration after the elections has got to deliver results very quickly, because that's the objective. You know, it's kind of, I have a Nasreddin Hoca joke for you regarding that. One day Hoca has lost his donkey, looking for his donkey everywhere, couldn't find it, but he's also singing while he's looking for his donkey. And the people come and, you know, tell him that, you know, why do you look so happy? You lost your donkey, couldn't find it. All the morning, you know, you have been looking for it, you couldn't find it. And then the Hoca says, you know, I have one last hope beyond this mountain over there. If I couldn't find it over there too, then you'll hear my cries. So I think the situation in Turkey, when they ask me about whether Turkey may have a Sri Lanka movement or not, I'd like to tell them this joke and tell them that, you know, the elections are very near. It's only about 8 months. So everybody is waiting for the elections to become a kind of a panacea, a solution for the problems in Turkey. And that puts a great responsibility on both sides, I think. I mean, if I were on both sides of the aisle, they have to work very hard about how to deliver results this time. Because if they can't do it, then it can be very difficult to manage the country as far as I see.
Thank you very much. Gulcin Hocam, there is a question. You have already actually answered that partially, because there's a question about this, how Germany's economic contraction can affect Turkey. Obviously, I don't believe that there are estimations on this, but would you like to comment?
Very briefly, I don't think there are estimations of that specific impact from Germany to Turkey, but as I already mentioned, IMF's estimation for Germany next year is contraction, and that we can imagine how it would be translated onto Turkey. Turkey is obviously very externally dependent in terms of its energy use, so huge imports, and that is a source of ongoing current account deficits. So that to me is the first round effects as a result of energy shocks. But through Germany, given that Germany itself is very reliant on energy and therefore forecast to contract, that's the main reason why it's forecast to contract in the European sample. And given that close relationship between Turkey and Germany, we would expect that second round impacts working through international trade channel. I don't have any estimates as such, but clearly Germany, again, within the EU sample, is one of the ones that's closely linked with Turkish trade. Therefore, I would expect those second round effects to be significant. I can't put a number on them, but they will be significant. Obviously, this will be more damaging the longer the energy crisis goes on.
Yeah, just let me to put also a question maybe a bit related to this, because this is the negative effect that can have on Turkey. But we are also hearing many, companies that are closing, or potentially they can also delocalize. That in Turkey, for the moment, at least, we don't see an energy crisis, let's say, at least not a supply crisis. So it's a question for both of you. Do you think that there would be energy intensive companies moving or their business to Turkey from Germany? Because obviously we are too much focused on this winter, but it's not limited to this winter. This winter, at least to prepare this winter, Germany included, many European countries, they received, even if it wasn't huge, they received still Russian gas. They could fill their stocks, let's say, up to 84–90%. Those are the numbers that we are hearing. But obviously next winter, after winter, next year, there are also concerns. I mean, in this case, we can expect, this kind of delocalization. Do you think that it can? And also, given, the political or economic situation in Turkey, still energy can be a reason to move to Turkey, for example, from Germany or other European countries. What do you think about this?
So, very briefly, I don't have any data to be very specific about relocation to Turkey, but already the energy crisis is making countries think very differently in terms of their energy policies. In that sense, I think Russia's invasion of Ukraine is backfiring very badly for Russia, because that clearly is having an impact on other countries that are working very hard to reduce reliance on Russian imports, to invest in renewables, which is consistent with the climate emergency. So a lot of changes are already happening, and this is not unrelated to the discussion we were having about supply chains, relocation of supply chains. So there is already some relocation activity. This might include energy. I mean, I know we have had a few discussions whether Turkey would benefit from this relocation of supply chains. I don't see the evidence as yet, but, you know, returning to our discussion about this good equilibrium and bad equilibrium, if Turkey manages to get its house in order, it might benefit from both.
Thank you. Guven Hoca, go ahead.
I agree. I mean, if there is a turnover, and there is a turnover in about 8 months, I think then there is a great opportunity for Turkey. And that's one reason why I feel myself optimistic about when I look at future, the near future. If you make the right decision regarding the issue of on whose side you are on, then I think it's possible for Turkey to renovate renovate the technology of its industry. I think that's what we need, and it's not that easy for for the energy intensive sectors to come into Turkey. That's one reason why Europe is taking all those measures. The carbon border adjustment thing is just that. So you have to make those adjustments in your country too. It's not so diversifying Russia is not only Europe's problem, but Turkey's problem too. And the best policy for Turkey is to use this opportunity to prepare projects, starting from energy transition, decarbonization plans, to diversify Russia as quickly as possible. I think this is a great opportunity for Turkey to jumpstart its own technological renovation by the help of our partners in the West. But I think we are losing ample time by these, short-term gimmickry, let's say, about whether we can ask the Russians to postpone the payment of gas for this year, work together with the Russian central bank on this. These are only increasing the risks in the post-election period for Turkey, I think, as far as I see, because this should be the time to focus on preparing projects for decarbonization and making plans how we are going to diversify Russia as quickly as possible. That's the new world, and when the new world is taking shape, you have to first of all decide your location. We all know on whose side you are on in this transformation. It's not a good decision, I think, to take the side of the loser in this case.
Thank you. Oh, this question, this is another question from Neva Sadıkoğlu, Novaki, and it's on the EU-Turkey relations. She's asking, how do you see EU-Turkey relations evolving given these dynamics? I partially answered all this question. Anything you feel that can be a stabilizing and positive effect that came out of the meetings this year? She's mentioning high-level dialogues meeting, I think, including EU-Turkey joining parliamentary committee, the high-level dialogues in climate and on agriculture, etc.
So I think Turkey-EU relationship has long been an anchor, external anchor for Turkey, and you can use that really to your advantage. That might happen going forward, but I think we moved away from that significantly with all the deterioration on the institution side, human rights, all the discussions with Europe, at least for 6-8 years. Now, where we are, this is a different position given the significance of your position regarding Ukraine versus Russia debate or war. Well, debate is so insignificant a word describing where we are. So Professor Sak gone into details of how this might impact Turkey. And I guess that the crucial thing is where Turkey is. If Turkey is viewed as a country that's facilitating Russia evading sanctions, that's going to be very difficult in terms of re-establishing that relationship with European Union, and hence establishing an anchor and an EU relationship as an external anchor. I don't know which way it's going to unfold. Again, I can see two projections here. You know, one is you could move in the positive direction where you could still view this, you would push yourself into a position where this is still a positive external anchor. The second is if you isolate yourself and is viewed as a country that is playing into hands of Russia, that's going to be very hard, if not impossible.
Would you like to go ahead?
I completely agree. Just, you know, EU has been very much important, and I think not the accession process this time, but customs union modernization is of utmost importance for Turkey. But there are, you know, political problems in the European Parliament, I think, just hindering the process. So it all depends on the result of the elections, if you ask me.
Yeah, thank you. Let me to add also this, because President Erdogan was also invited to Prague this last week for the meeting of European political community. I mean, as you said, Gulcin, this war and this new geopolitical situation is also giving a new opportunity to maybe to improve the relations. But it's, as you said, Guven Hoca, and you as well, it will depend much on the political will from Ankara as well. Unfortunately, we lost for good my colleague Jakob. This is a pity, because there was a question that I think was great for him, because he predicted that the war will end in 5-6 months. So the question from my colleague from GMF is asking, what would be the macroeconomic impact of a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine? Would you like to comment on this? Difficult.
I'm not expecting a ceasefire, let me say it that way, because I see this Russia-Ukraine thing within the framework of this whole Green Deal process. So I think this is ample time, because if you look at the countries around Turkey especially, you know, many of the countries are going to lose as a result of this transformation process, digital and green transformation process. And those are basically around Turkey, and they are all hydrocarbon producers. Countries are trying to transform themselves in order to cope with the situation. I mean, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they have been trying to do things. But Russia has been losing out. And I think among those losers of this process, Russia is the biggest country, and it is the most dangerous one because of the nuclear warheads. And I think it is ample time to de-weaponize, find a way to defuse Russia as quickly as possible, because 10 years from now it's going to become more dangerous. So it's good for them to come to their senses as quickly as possible. I mean, we have been expecting geopolitical implications. There were discussions about the geopolitical implications of the Green Deal process. I think this is the major, most dangerous of the geopolitical implications. And if that can be diffused in Ukraine, good for all of us in the region, and also globally, it's good for all of us. I think so. I'm not expecting a ceasefire, an end to this thing very soon. An end could only be possible if Crimea become part of Ukraine again, if you ask me. Because now we are on the things are on that scale now. And regarding, you know, Turkey's position, although we are in close contact with Russia and all the other things, you know, in blaming Russia for the annexation of those new places in Ukraine, Turkey was one of the countries that brought the paper or the declaration. You know, we signed that thing also. So Turkey also took the right position in some of the areas, but because of this coming elections and the winter problems, as the winter is coming and the problems related with that, I think it is possible for Turkey to take riskier positions. So all in all, when you look at generally, Turkey took the right position regarding Russian aggression in Ukraine. In the United Nations, we took the right position regarding that issue in all the discussions, as far as I see. But on the ground, when it comes to tourism revenues, when it comes to finding and paying for natural gas, we have some weak spots, as far as I see.
Thank you very
just
much.
add very briefly,
Briefly,
about
yes,
the
please.
macroeconomic
Yeah.
implications. So when we were looking at inflation and the difference between core inflation and headline inflation, on average, headline inflation is averaging about 8.59% and core inflation about 5%. So although inflation is very high and obviously 40-year high, a lot of it is coming from energy, but not all of it. So even if we have a resolution in Ukraine, Russia, war ends, and suppose that we retreat from the energy crisis as we face it now, it would only take off half of that in inflation. Now, if you think about the major economies' inflation target being around 2%, they would still have to be very strict in their monetary policy. So all the negative consequences of that we discussed today, as obviously financial turmoil, higher cost of financing for countries like Turkey, would still be there, would be smaller in scale, but would still be there. Monetary policy in center countries would still be front-loaded. Maybe they wouldn't need to take policy rates to such high levels, but they will still need to hike rates before we get some stability on inflation front. So everything we talked about will still apply to countries, including Turkey, maybe to a lesser extent. I don't expect it to be reversed completely, even if we achieve that end of war.
Thank you very much. And we are time. I think we have to wrap up now. Gulcin Hocam, thank you very much. Guven Hocam, thank you very much. It was great. I think it was a terrific discussion. And I would like to also thank my colleague Jakub that we lose. But I am sure I will see him again. And I would like to also thank our audience for joining, and my colleagues who help us with the technical and other organizational aspects. So hope to see you soon again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.